לנו גם אורחת, ואני זוכר שכשהיינו מקיימים כנסים בבית לוחמי גטאות, היינו דואגים שיהיה מישהו מחוץ לארץ, כדי שנגיד, זה כנס בינלאומי. אז יש לנו כנס בינלאומי היום. אני אציג בעברית את האורחת, אחרי זה באנגלית, ואז נשמע אותה. המרצה הבאה היא גברת אווה קלוסובה, מהמרכז ללימודי יהדות השם קורט ואורסולה שוברט, אוניברסיטת פלאצ'י באולומוש. אולומוק, אבל זה אולומוש, והפקולטה למדעי הרוח, אוניברסיטת פראג, צ'כיה. גברת קולוסובה היא היסטוריונית המתמקדת במחקר על הגירת יהודי צ'כיה במאה ה-20. כעת מבצעת מחקר בנושא העברת טראומת השואה לדור השני, תוך השוואה של המצב לאחר המלחמה בצ'כוסלובקיה ומדינות אחרות, ובעיקר ישראל, בשיתוף פעולה עם אוניברסיטאות בישראל, ביניהן אוניברסיטת בר אילן. נושא הרצאתה, העברת טראומת השואה לדור השני של ניצולי שואה, השוואה בין צ'כיה וישראל. It is my privilege to leave the stage to Eva Kalusova, studied history, English and American studies, and translation studies at the Palachi University of Olomouc, Czech Republic. She focused her thesis on migration of Czech Jews in the 20th century. During her MA studies, she was international in founding Kurt and Ursula Schubert Center for Jewish Studies at the Palachi University. She is now working on a dissertation at the Charles University in Prague on the transfer of trauma from Holocaust to the second generation, comparing post-trauma situation in Czechoslovakia and other countries, especially Israel. She combines oral history and archival research. She works at the Kurt and Ursula Schubert Center for Jewish Studies and on university level coordinates relations with Israel partners. Eva Kolosova lecture topic is transfer of trauma from Holocaust to the second generation survivors, comparison on development in Czechoslovakia and Israel. Eva, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It is my honor to be with you, at least online, at this conference from the Czech Republic. And I would like to also thank very much to Dr. Hadas Šašalavský for inviting me to the conference after we visited Bar Ilan University in October. Before I focus on the trauma from the Holocaust on the second generation, I would like to say a few words about the Czech Jewish community. I think it's important to realize that Czechs, Jews, and Germans lived in Czech lands together for very many centuries, and only the 20th century brought an abrupt end to this coexistence with its two totalitarian regimes. And also, I would like to say a few facts about the Holocaust of the Czech Jews. After the Munich conference in the fall of 1938, when the border regions, the so-called Sudetenland, were occupied by the Nazi Germany, then in March 1939, the so-called Protectorate Bohemia and Moravia was formed in a Czech part of Czechoslovakia, and it actually became the satellite state of Nazi Germany, which meant that the anti-Jewish measures became valid and many anti-Jewish decrees were issued. At the beginning of the Protectorate, there was forced emigration to the Jewish minority. However, the problem was if some Jewish people decided to leave, very often there was no place to go because the affidavits or permissions were already used by the Austrian or German Jews. The anti-Jewish persecution reached its peak with the deportations, mostly to the ghetto of Terezín or Theresienstadt, and then most of the Jews continued their way to Auschwitz. To give us an image of the Holocaust in the Czech lands, the whole tragedy meant that if we think about the pre-war Czechoslovakia, which included also today's Slovakia and Subcarpathian Russia, which is today parts of Ukraine, the total balance of victims was 272,000. If we think about Czech lands, 80,000 out of 120,000 Jewish people perished in the Shoah. After the war, the survivors were coming back from the death and concentration camps, and also from hiding, and then also from foreign armies, where their participation, of the Jewish emigres was very significant, and they were facing various problems. Of course, primarily the loss of most family members and friends. They have had problems with restitution of the property, which was confiscated by the Nazi regime. And very briefly afterwards, it was not possible because of the communist regime. Some of the Jewish survivors were even included in the transports of Czech Germans who were expelled from Czechoslovakia. And that was very difficult for the Jewish survivors. There were also cases of anti-Semitism, and all of these problems led to the decision of very many survivors in Czechoslovakia, nearly half of the survivors, to leave the country. They emigrated to several countries, and what is most important for us, Palestine and later Israel. Then also, I think we are acknowledged with the situation in Israel in the post-war era. But to give us background for the situation in which the families we speak about lived in, I would like to say a few words about the post-war Czechoslovakia. Right after the war, Czechoslovakia very much supported Israel, voted for the state in the United Nations. What was very significant was the military help of Czechoslovakia to the new state of Israel, despite the embargo. However, after the international situation changed, communist Czechoslovakia completely changed its relationship towards Israel and persecuted its Jews. The, I would say, most symbolic and maybe most tragic example is the Slansky Trio in 1952, when the top representatives of the Communist Party were accused to be spies against the regime. They were said to be responsible for the problems of the post-war economy and so on. And it was focused, it was stressed that they are of Jewish origin, although none of them were really religious Jews. Most of these accused Jews were executed in the trial. Some of them were sentenced to lifelong jail. The situation then melted, as we say, a bit in the 1960s, when, for example, Franz Kafka was more celebrated, and also there were preparations for the Prague Jewish Museum and its anniversary. However, the hopes for freedom were stopped again in 1968 when Czechoslovakia was occupied by the Soviet Union. The topic of transfer of trauma from the Holocaust to the second generation is quite discussed in the Czech Republic recently by scholars and doctors in the field, and also by the students. And we have a center, Raphael Institute in Prague, which carries out research, publishes many books on the topics, and also provides support to the survivors and their families. you can see on the slide the book The Children of the Holocaust by Helen Epstein. I am mentioning it because I think many Czechs draw from this book when they discuss the topic, because also Helen was of Czech origin. Both her parents were survivors from Czechoslovakia. Then they emigrated to United States. Scholars defined various manifestations or symptoms of the trauma from the Holocaust to the second generation. We can speak about the huge fear of the parents, about the problematic relationship to the food or nutrition. We can look at the parents-children relations, on the personal relations of the second generation, on the career of the children or the second generation. We can also discuss the problematic iron box that Helen Epstein discusses in her book, or the so-called commemorative candle that Gabby Glesman from Great Britain labels the children of the Holocaust who are, for example, given the same name as the past relatives, or they are expected to fulfill the dreams of the parents. Also very problematic can be the separation of the children from their parents. As an oral historian, I carry out interviews with the survivors and their families, and the case study of my research is a former Jewish community in Uherský Brod or Ungarisch Brod in German, or in some sources. You can see the location of the town today. It's close to the border with Slovakia and also Austria. And I interviewed the families who either remained in Czechoslovakia after the war or emigrated to Israel in the post-war area, mainly post-war era. As a symbol of the local Holocaust, you can see the picture of the burnt synagogue that was set afire by the local people, and the Uherský Brod mayor, who collaborated with the Nazis, prevented the firemen from saving the synagogue. I would now like to give examples from my research from the families that I interviewed, and they are both from the, say, Czech side and Israeli side. For example, I talked to one family in Israel where the father was the survivor of the Holocaust, and after the war, he decided to leave Czechoslovakia and settle in Israel. His daughter, the second generation member, speaks about the problems to find a partner for life. She said, "It was difficult to find a life partner for me. Experiences of my parents were also a heavy burden in my life. However, later I overcame this burden of the past, and in my nearly 40 years, I got married. My career, contrary to personal life, was not affected by the family trauma. For my whole life, I worked in a high position in the state administration." Then one more example now from the Czech family. I mentioned the trauma that can be demonstrated in the problematic relationship towards nutrition or food. The daughter from the family told me that her mother, the first generation survivor, always hid a piece of food somewhere. She always wanted to be sure that that she has a piece of bread under her pillow, in her pocket, or something like that. Also, she was forcing her children to eat enough or too much. So, as I said, this is a rather problematic relationship to food or nutrition in the family of survivors that can occur. On the other hand, I also encountered families where it seems that there is no negative impact on the children, on the second generation from the Holocaust. This family has 2 daughters, and after speaking to the mother several times and to one of the daughters, it seems to me that the family is healthy, happy, and well-balanced. Then there is a question of identity. Survivors that were my narrators in Israel were emigres to Israel, and therefore their identity was either both Czech and Israeli, or they completely accepted identity as Israelis. It is described that sometimes the parents felt lonely in the new homeland, and the identity of the survivors was manifested in their names. Some of them wanted to change their German-sounding names to Czech or Israeli names. My research confirmed both options. For example, in a Czech family, Uherský Brod, there was a German name, Bramer, and the family kept it, and also the next generation, second generation. On the other hand, another branch of the family that emigrated to Israel changed the German name Bramer to Barnea. Then in another family, there was a name Bock, and the first generation survivor, he told me that it's a name, although it's a German name, it's a name of his father, and he will never change it. However, his relative and also his son changed the name to Ben Asher.
Eva, 2 more minutes.
Just getting to the end. So I would like to say that so far I have come to the conclusion that the impact of the Holocaust on the second generation was transferred to some of the members of the researched families. I think that one of the main features of how the second generation perceived the trauma from the Holocaust were the characters of the parents and the way parents worked the trauma through. Another aspect that plays a role sometimes is the fact if the survivors' families lived alone, or if they found a good group of friends, or maybe even friends with similar fate or experiences, who understood, or even without words, understood each other and could, for example, share time together. Also, the political and social situation played their roles, but more on general level. In Czechoslovakia, with its communist regime, Holocaust history of the family was a taboo in many cases for a very long time, while in Israel, in Jewish society, as some of the narrators say, the history and trauma of the Holocaust became part of the nation's identity. Thank you very much for your attention.